Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And so it's been 3 years since I started this, and I've kind of settled on the idea that on the year anniversary I'll talk about something that is book adjacent. In this case, I will be talking once again about fan fiction. Last time I just gave a general defensive fan fiction, but this time I'm going to talk about a particular subgenre of fanfic that is particularly problematic. Now, the thing about fanfiction, of course, is that fanfic doesn't have quite the same genres of reading that people are used to. You know, when you talk about books, you tend to have genres like fiction, nonfiction, fantasy, science fiction, science history. But fan fiction, you tend to have genres that are slightly more specific in terms of the kind of story it is, rather than the kind of emotional response people want than what we would traditionally consider to be genre. That is, fan fiction tends to come in humor or angst or tragedy, which some of these, yes, are to an extent genres, but the idea is that you're saying this is a story set in that particular universe, which is supposed to elicit this kind of emotional response. And so, you know, romance, because of course any given work of fan fiction is already existing within a particular genre. You write Star Trek fan fiction, you're already existing within the science fiction genre. So that kind of has to be taken as read. In this case, this is really a subgenre because the so-called MST, which is, yes, based on Mystery Science Theater, the MST genre of fan fiction is a subgenre, but in some ways it's its own thing, because most MSTs are in fact done for humorous effect, as the original Mystery Science Theater was. As, to pick an example, Jenny W., who stopped writing in the late 90s, early 2000s, it's really, since it has now been 19 years, give or take, I genuinely don't know how long, exactly what year it was, but the thing is that she wrote the Mystery Slayer Theater series. She had it pulled from the internet. There was some kind of ongoing harassment that made her do it. And so if she has returned to the internet, I assume it's going to have been under a completely different name, and I would never be able to point you towards her. Not that I would, because, let's be honest, if it was a harassment campaign, she deserves not to suddenly be harassed again all these years later. And her Mystery Slayer Theater started off as... and I still have access to these because there was a lag between the announcement that she was going offline, in effect, and when she actually did, which was mostly to allow people to save copies of her fanfics if they wanted for themselves. And she started with doing, and I am not going to read the whole thing to you, nor am I going to post the whole thing. If you don't have it, then I'm sorry, you're not going to get them. But what she started off doing was having the characters of Buffy the Vampire Slayer making fun of spam emails. This particular one is entitled The Key to Happier Moods, which is a spam email she got from an ostensible Dr. Norm Ephraim, a supposedly licensed psychologist, who sent out spam emails about getting his book and getting his anti-depression uh, um, his anti-depression program that he advertised through spam emails. And, you know, a lot of spams, like the notorious Nigerian prince emails, they do deserve to be made fun of. And so there wasn't that much of a problem with it, but eventually, of course, whether it's a make money fast, which was a sort of a pyramid scheme, or any of these other things, eventually you run out of jokes to make, and so at that point she moved on to bad fan fictions. Now, bad fanfics probably go through regular vogues. I don't know, I haven't participated deeply enough in any fandom of late to really be sure of that, but the bad fanfiction is the deliberately poorly written fanfic for comedic effect. They are there's a very strong crossover between them and the so-called crack fics. But the idea is that you write them poorly in order to be funny. And so she moved on to that. Let's move on to as well. This is a Star Wars parody in which the various Buffy characters are sort of slotted into the roles of various Star Wars characters. So instead of C-3PO, you have Cordy-PO, and instead of R2-D2, you have R2-Will-2, and Prince Xander of Cretinan, and Buffy Mallwalker, and Angel Broodlurker, who turned into Darth Angelus. If you know the series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you will understand why several of these are very funny. And what happened was, of course, the various Buffy characters are trapped on a satellite, being forced to read this, and dealing with these depictions of themselves. Now, the thing is, this was fine for Jenny W., who sometimes would go to the then extant Bad Fanfics website. There was one, I don't know if it's still there. I don't think so, because it was an Angel Fire Lycos or GeoCities website, which means it's very possibly just doesn't exist anymore, although I suppose it might on the Wayback Machine. Feel free to look for it. Best of luck. But there's a problem when you start talking about people MSTing things more generally. And we'll bring this up on fanfiction.net, which I'm going to state for the record, fanfic.net many, many years ago now officially banned MSTs. They just didn't want to deal with them, because the problem with doing an MST of, say, a bad fanfiction is, what happens when it's a bad fanfic that the author of that fanfic thinks is good? When everybody is merciless in making fun of it, and you have suddenly somebody there whose feelings have been tremendously hurt, and who may just be an unfortunate 13-year-old who isn't as good a writer as they think they are, getting, absolutely just, raked over the coals. And, I mean, it's a fundamental problem with the internet that, those of us who are older can remember being 13 years old and not having the ability to post something for everyone ever to see and make fun of. It was bad enough when you screwed up in front of class, because that was only, 30 people. But now somebody can post something on fanfic.net and goodness knows, it's something that people can make fun of forever and ever and ever. So, FF.net banned them, partly because of that, but also partly because of a fascinating little thing that people started to do, and you found it a lot in the Harry Potter fandom, which is, and I've got an example right here, the Marauder's view of Harry. And this particular one, midway down the page, is a concept where you have the characters, in this case of Harry Potter, reading the books about them and commenting on books about them. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that at that point, you're violating copyright rather openly and wildly. And so it's a very dangerous game to post that, because this is just blatant copyright infringement. And it's the kind of thing that if one were so inclined, if you found one of these MSTs, you could, in fact, get a bootleg copy of the book because someone else had basically just copied it down. Now, the part of this that always leaves me torn is that it's a very interesting idea to imagine Harry or the Marauders or, you name it, reading this book about themselves, being able to see what happens from the outside, or having characters who aren't directly involved in those events, but getting to read about them. Any story that is the Marauders read Harry Potter, well, you're dealing with people who know the Harry Potter world but don't know these characters, or don't know the younger characters but recognize all of the older ones, and it's an interesting concept for a perspective. And well-written ones, putting aside the terrible ones, which, I mean, like Sturgeon's Law says, 90% of everything is crap. But it's an interesting idea. So on the one hand, I appreciate it, and it's not something that I would ever do to tell people, to announce this, to get these flagged on websites, because I do enjoy reading them if they're well written and amusing. I probably wouldn't read this one, not least of which because it hasn't been updated since 2004, and also because, well, it's one chapter. But it's a very interesting idea. And so when you look at these, when you look at this concept of characters reading fan fiction about themselves, it's very, very interesting to imagine how these characters would feel about it. One suspects much the same way that Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki feel when somebody throws them a real person fan fiction about themselves. But it's a very interesting idea to just explore that. It's an interesting idea to explore how these people would react if faced with themselves from an outside perspective, not the experience of going through it, but the experience of seeing what decisions you made now that you have a little space and distance and aren't in the middle of a given situation. How does that, how does being able to sort of go over it step by step from the outside, as told by a neutral third party, in effect, but to be able to say, maybe that was a dumb idea, it's an interesting concept, and so I enjoy it, I like it, but it violates copyright. And the fan fiction ones, well, those can be incredibly mean-spirited because, as I said before, what happens if you're somebody who's put in a very genuine effort to write a good fan fiction and people just rip it to shreds? So, I like MSTs conceptually. I like some MSTs a lot just straight up. But at the same time, I find that it's a subgenre that leaves me very, very torn. And I don't have any solutions. I don't have any comments about how to handle this problem or not. I'm just giving a ramble about the whole concept. And I think that's all that I have to say about that. So thank you for listening to this to the end, assuming you're still listening, and I will see you next week.